Is it time to put respect on Bud Crawford's name? This man right here is with me, and we're going to discuss that on this special edition of The Cornermen. What's up, everyone? Welcome back to this special edition of The Cornermen, the super fight edition of The Cornermen. As you know, as we were recording this, last night was the second biggest fight of the year. You could argue it was the biggest fight of the year, and that was Bud Crawford and Errol Spence. And boy, was it a fight. And so Cleve and I decided to record something about this, little reaction. It's going to be a little shorter than our last episode. Supreme is not with us, but we are here to kind of break it down and just give all those boxing fans out there a little bit of our peace of mind. So Cleve, how you doing, buddy?
Good, man. Good. Hot. It's hot in the old, I guess this is the South.
I guess you could say that.
Yeah. Do people still say Mason-Dixon line? Is that proper to say these days? I don't even know.
You want to know something? Being from Rhode Island, I was obviously from the North, and I heard about this famed Mason-Dixon line a lot. I heard more about it when I went to school at Virginia Tech, and I remember finding out that it was in Maryland. I was like, it's way further north than I ever thought.
You just taught me something, because I'm thinking it was like the Carolinas somewhere.
I mean, somebody who's listening, by the way, you can call or text the show 703-718-6314 if you want to let us know that we're wrong. But I believe it is in Maryland somewhere. I was surprised to know that, because you got to think about this, right? When this country was founded, it was a lot smaller.
Yeah.
So if you think about when the Civil War happened, it wasn't nearly what it is today, to where the Mason-Dixon line probably was a lot further south. I mean, wasn't the capital of Virginia, or the capital of the South, wasn't it like Alexandria or Richmond or something like that?
It was actually Richmond. That was the seat of the Confederacy.
Exactly. So the Mason-Dixon line being in Maryland makes a lot of sense. Today it doesn't, because we go all the way down to basically Puerto Rico. So
yeah,
Maryland seems more north than that to me.
And you know what's crazy? I just learned something about the history of Virginia. Not that we're going off on a tangent here. That how two Virginias became known today as West Virginia, and Virginia. It's kind of a crazy thing about them being taxed because of slavery and all of that kind of stuff. It was an interesting thing. I just learned about the history of Virginia. I did not know that.
Well, West Virginia can take a flyer as far as I'm concerned. I do not like that state. So let's move on to this big fight. So last time we were here, we are an entity of the I&C Sports paradigm, as everybody knows by now. And we had a great talk about where boxing is today, kind of how we got into this place. And one of the fights that Supreme talked about that he wanted to see was this fight. Now, we knew it was going to happen. And so it has come and gone. And I'm just going to say a few things. I want to say, for all of the viewers and listeners, I have not watched this fight. So if you're going to come at me with, tell me you didn't watch the fight without telling me you didn't watch the fight, I didn't watch the fight yet, but I have seen some highlights, and I do have opinions about the business of how we got here, and also just in general, some opinions about how we feel about the outcome of the fight. But I think coming in, you are one of the people who has been a detractor of Bud Crawford. Is that correct?
That is correct. And I did have to eat some crow, and I will give the man his flowers on this episode.
And I think that it's fair. I opened up with, should we be giving him his due? And I think a lot of people, you're not the only one. Supreme talked about it as well. And if you go online, a lot of people calling Bud Crawford a bum, basically, because of who he hasn't fought.
Correct.
One of the things we talked about last time, though, was how we got to this place where we're not getting these fights, how the promoters are not giving us the biggest fights. And this fight in particular, I think, was probably 4 years too late.
I could say that. I mean, some of the people that, and this is post Errol Spence's car accident. If whoever didn't know about this, he had a horrific car accident drinking and driving a few years ago, and he's had 2 fights since the accident. Kind of look the same, but kind of something has been a little bit different. But again, no excuses are made on behalf of this fighter. I mean, this is the business that he traffics in, and it is what it is. If you're not prepared, you're not prepared. I don't kind of give you a pass for that. Yeah, this fight, had this happened a couple of years ago, different. And again, I have, as you alluded to, I have kind of questioned the opponents of Crawford, and I question his promoter. I'm not a big fan of Bob Arum. Never will be. And I just feel that he kept him away from a lot of big fights. But I'm glad it came when it came, because it does give him an idea of what his future could look like with all of these belts. He's the alphabet soup champion right now.
What sucks about what you just alluded to is the fact that a great fighter, a very skilled fighter, a guy who, you talked about this offline with me, has decided when he's going to take guys out in a fight.
Yeah.
And that you saw on display in this fight, especially at the end.
Mm-hmm.
And what surprised me the most was how unprepared Errol Spence looked for this moment. And I'm not saying it's just this moment, but I think just in general, you were expecting him to come into this fight ready to go, because I think to date, this was probably the most important fight that he's had to be able to, I think, unify that division. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And when you have the opportunity to do that, it's a big deal nowadays because there are so many champions in all of these divisions. To be able to clean house in a division and really reign supreme, no pun intended, Rich, that's a big deal. And to come in looking the way that he did and get beaten as soundly as he did is embarrassing for him, his camp, and his promoter. And Bud Crawford has to feel on top of the world right now because all of those doubters and haters, they can't say anything to him anymore.
Mm-hmm. So to echo what you're kind of sounding off on, and when we talk about preparation, we're talking about having the time, fortitude to train for a fight. So who am I sitting as a couch commentator on how prepared a guy could be, but is prepared. How should they be prepared for a fight? This is a big fight. This is a unification fight, and those fights are a little bit different. I talked to Supreme today offline, and one of the things that I echoed, and this comes from the Conor McGregor fight with Mayweather, is that boxing is like NASCAR in a sense where you look for the crash, the big knockout, the big victory. I love the technical aspect of fights. I love seeing a guy getting broken down. I love the work that is put in camps that manifests itself in the final product. But the thing is that when someone stops a fight, when you're losing by a stoppage, it's a little different from getting knocked out, right? You get knocked out, you don't make the 10 count, it's over. But when someone has to pull another guy off of you because you're getting just pounded, it says a lot about how prepared you were, because he looked more and more gassed as the fight went on. I didn't watch the last round. I saw the last round as a highlight of the final, coup de grace, so to speak. But he didn't look prepared to me. He looked kind of flat, if I may put that in there.
And I think that's a fair criticism, and it's really just an observation. And you had a come to Jesus moment with this with Kell Brook, if I remember.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to say it was when he fought Triple G.
Triple G, yeah.
And he had a broken orbital bone.
Yeah.
And I believe he didn't quit on the bench, but I think the fight was stopped. And I think you were very harsh about him at that time. And then you found out what he went through. I think, didn't he break both orbital bones at one point in his career?
Yeah, the second. So kind of going back on that, and I did recant my statements, even online at the time. I was in a boxing forum and I was spouting a lot of stupid stuff. And then I had to realize when I watched the fight again from a different angle and I saw his actual bone sticking out of his cheek, I realized, okay, who am I to say a guy's soft or a guy can't withstand his punishment, or why did he give up? He ended up getting the other orbital bone crushed in a subsequent fight, and then ultimately, like, he kind of just been obscure since then. But yeah, I had to retract and redact my statements.
I thought that was important to bring up because what you're saying here about Errol Spence and his lack of preparation, or seemingly lack of preparation, you have had those same criticisms of Andy Ruiz when he had the heavyweight title, which on top of the world, and didn't take it seriously. And we don't know, we're not going to cast aspersions on what happened with Errol Spence, but Supreme made some observations about the way that he looked coming into this fight. It's very surprising because Errol Spence is a guy, and yes, he hasn't been exactly the same as before the accident, a sharp fighter. Always came in looking sharp at every fight. I mean, he's fought some good guys too. Like, he took out Danny Garcia, who's a good fighter, a really good fighter.
So to note this, and Supreme and I talked about this offline again, when Errol gets since post-accident, when he gets into a good combination thrown at him, he tends to turn away. And it happened in the Ugas fight, and it happened against Garcia, where he got caught and he literally turned his back, and he had like a momentary lapse. I don't know if that's a concentration thing or if that's neurological since the accident. But again, I'm not in his head. I'm not his doctor. I'm not his neurologist to know that this to be true. But I know watching a fighter make those type of mental lapses against another good fighter, it's not a good situation to be in, especially in a big fight, unification fight.
And against a guy who you know is a stone cold killer.
Yeah, we talked about Crawford being a sadist, so to speak. And again, this is my opinion of it because in the Jeff Horn fight, he had the guy pretty much dead to rights, and then he was told, "Hey, let's wrap this up." And I was like, "Wow!" Like, and he goes out and just closes the show. And I think that watching this fight, he could have ended this fight a lot earlier, but I think there was a statement had to be made. I think he was sending a statement to the whole division, and he was sending a statement to Spence's camp that I got your guy beat. He actually even said in the second round, he said he caught a good shot, and he literally said, "Wait a minute, that's it? Is that's all the power he has? Oh, this is gonna be good." He actually said that, which again makes me believe that this guy traffics in the punishment department. Like, I'm gonna punish this guy.
Now, last time we spoke, we talked about Tank and Ryan Garcia and the hydration clause. There's none of that kind of thing with this fight. This was pretty straight up, I believe. There wasn't anything that you could go back and say, "Oh, I question that," and maybe that took away some of Spence's power. From what I understand in the business of all of this was a straight up 1-to-1 matchup here. There wasn't anything crazy about it. No weird weigh-in clauses, hydration clauses, anything. And they came in theoretically on equal footing. And for a guy to not have power, I'm curious what happened there, and I wonder if we will find out more. But what I don't want to happen is for people to take away what Bud Crawford did in this fight, because I'm sorry, prepared or not, you're stepping in the ring with the same risks and everything, because Errol Spence could have caught him with one, ended the fight, because you talked about a knockout. Knockouts can happen all the time. Manny Pacquiao got knocked out a few times in his career, still considered one of the best because of the body of work of what he had. And so for Crawford to go in there and say that, and be like, that's all that the guy has. He knew he was in control from that moment on. And that's what makes him such a special guy, because very rarely do you watch a guy do that, where you have been watching boxing for 40 some odd years.
Yeah.
And there's probably only a handful of guys that you can say, I knew when they knew they were in control.
Yeah.
And to do that in the biggest fight of his career says something. And Bud is on the later end of what is considered to be young for a fighter. Isn't he 32 or 33?
And that was always my problem with his promotion, is that as a fighter, skilled fighter, I just always thought he never got the exposure that he should have gotten and the fights that he should have gotten. I mean, he caught Gamboa late. I mean, that was a statement win against Gamboa, but Gamboa was a fighter was infrequent as a fighter. He never really fought a lot. But Bud could have had these fights a lot early in his career, and I'm kind of glad to see that he is the unified champion. He has all the belts that actually matters, and he can call his plate now. He's going to have to take these contenders, whether Arum doesn't want those fights to happen or not. He's going to have to take these, unless, he wants to be stripped of his title.
Do you think he was ducking guys, or do you think it has more to do with money on Bob Arum's part? Like, if it were up to Bud Crawford, do you think he's like, all right, line him up right now?
I think for fighters, you're in the game for two reasons. Obviously, we would be hard-pressed to say that a guy doesn't want to get paid for a dangerous sport, a dangerous existence, but also you want to have that resume. You want to, at least from my lens, you want to have that resume of who you beat. Again, Supreme and I'm sorry he's not here today, but we talked about Shakur Stevenson, right? Taking the high road of not accepting what Devin Haney wanted to offer him, because Devin Haney now is fighting some guy that Supreme says is good. I have to go look the guy up, and that's happening in October. But if you're really about that action, I'll take the 25%. Go in there, beat you down, and when you want the rematch, now I hold the cards. Now I hold the belts. Now I can say, you know what? You offered me 25%. You're going to take that same 25% or take nothing.
So you just said rematch. Do you foresee a rematch in this particular avenue, or do you think it's a Bud Crawford is going to say, I beat you so soundly, you don't deserve it?
Yeah, unless something comes out dramatic about maybe he got hurt in camp, or maybe he wasn't 100% or something. There's no need for a rematch. I mean, I didn't see enough there that would warrant a rematch. Rematches usually happen when the fight was so close, it went to the cards and one guy felt slighted. But this was a sound beating that a rematch would only be for them to really kind of get a bag. I mean, that's how I see that.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because Errol Spence coming into this fight could have really cemented himself in having the bag you talked about. Like, he could have decided to move up or do whatever he wanted to do.
Mm-hmm.
And now he's in that precarious position that fighters find them in after a loss. And this is almost done for him.
Yeah, one or two losses, as you know, in watching what happens now in boxing, because boxing is not really promoted the way the UFC is. And by the way, the UFC had a fight night the same night as his fight and was not worried about doing their numbers.
Nope.
They were not worried because, as Supreme says, they do an event every month. They got a major fight every month. So they've cornered the market, so to speak, on fight combat sports. They have got it in the bag. But yeah, going back to what you said, you get one or two, losses, that's nobody wants to see you again. And one of the things that I agree with Supreme about this morning as we talked, he said that the undercard could have been a little bit more to it. It was okay fights. And again, I'm not shitting on anyone's camp for taking a fight or whatever. It's exposure is exposure. But he said that having a fight, and he reminded me of fights back in the 80s and 90s where your undercard could have been top billing for any one of those headliners. Like Roy Jones was on a Mike Tyson undercard back in the day. I forgot about that. Roy Jones at the top of his career or in the middle of his prime was opening up for Mike Tyson. So you wanted to get these guys exposure, have all these fights on the same night as this main event.
Couldn't you make the argument that these fights, these super fights, happen so infrequently that they should have the best possible undercard that they could possibly get? Like, guys should be lining up to be on this undercard because they don't happen very often. And that's not any way of throwing shade at the fights that do happen. Boxing fights do happen on a weekly basis. I believe Friday night you can still find fights that are on, FS1 or something like that. But these are the young and hungry guys who are coming up in the sport who are looking to make their name. But these big pay-per-view fights, even when we first met 7 years ago, there were more pay-per-view fights then than there are now. I mean, this fight on pay-per-view is one of what feels like is going to be 4, maybe this year. Most of the fights are on ESPN Plus, which you can get for $5 a month.
I mean, you couldn't have said any better. I mean, look at the last 5 years, or let's call it 3 years since the pandemic. The major draws in boxing have been gimmicky YouTuber stuff. And I'm not going to say anyone's name to give them any more props than they need to get, but it's getting to the point it's so ridiculous now that Pacquiao is going to fight what's the guy, the famous kickboxer in Thailand. It's actually who does care, but this is what's an 8 division champion who has nothing to prove, who has made or should have made enough money to last him his lifetime, is fighting a guy. Like, for what? I think it's Bukaw. Yeah, Bukaw. He's fighting Bukaw. And I don't understand why this is happening or if he's fighting for the Philippines to have money. I don't know what it is because he's one of those fighters like Roberto Duran, who's about God and country. Some of these athletes, they get taken advantage of because, again, they're so hard-pressed for saving the nation that they'll take fights. I mean, there's no reason for him to take a fight with a kickboxer. For what?
You just said something that really triggered me because we're in this place, in this era now. And you talk about YouTubers and content creators. Okay, clout chasers. That's what we got called. We were accused of being clout chasers. But we train for this sport. We love the sport. But we also understand the risks that come along with this sport. One of the things that really bothers me, and you send me the Barstool guys all the time, or the backstreet fighting, and I say this to you every time, that this is the lowest common denominator, not just of the sport, but almost in society. And again, I'm not saying I'm better than everybody else or anything like that, but this is a dangerous sport, folks. And if you're somebody who does YouTube and all of a sudden you want to use boxing as a way to get even more clout, you're going to run into the wrong person at some point in time. And it could be the difference between you having your mental faculties and your physical abilities than you not having them. This is not the kind of sport that you use to get some self-recognition. But I have to give the Paul brothers credit. They at least train and do things the right way.
Correct, yeah.
To participate in the sport. But I'm not here for these backyard guys. I am not here for these. They have a whole card of people who are like content creators or influencers. And I'm like, look, go shill your product somewhere on social media.
Mm-hmm.
Do it safely from the comfort of your own home.
Mm-hmm.
I don't need to see you out there. I don't need to see the guy from Epic Mealtime get his ass handed to him and be thankful that he's not hurt even more.
Yeah. I mean, anyone out there who doesn't go to a boxing gym, to not even a boxing gym, that go to any one of these type of gyms that promote boxing as a conditioning workout, it's different from actually going to a boxing gym, doing some pad work or doing some boxing, actually similar to sparring. It is dangerous. You can just be playing around and take a header, take a shot, and that's it. Neurologically, that's it. You don't see. I had a tooth knocked out doing pad work with a guy a couple of years ago at the gym. Like, I'm holding pads, and this guy's undisciplined. I looked away for a split second and gave him a command to throw a punch, and next thing you know, I'm whistling Dixie.
But this bothers me so much because the millions of dollars that are getting thrown around for these guys and these undercards, right? But this is the best the sport can give us.
Yeah.
That's sad, man. It's really sad when your sport is in a place where UFC doesn't even consider you a competitor. Don't even care. Like, Dana White lost 0 winks of sleep knowing that he had a fight card on top of the boxing super fight of the year. And I guarantee you the UFC still drew better than boxing that night.
I mean, you're talking like throwing the Grey Cup on when the Super Bowl's happening. That's the equivalent of what happened, where they did not care because, as Supreme says, their prelims started at 12 o'clock in the afternoon and ran to the main event, which is like 10, 11 o'clock at night. So you got a card of fights, knockouts, whatever you're there to see. And here's the thing that bothers me, man. Like, boxing has been around for so long, right? I mean, you're talking mega fights in the 50s, 60s, 40s, even the 30s, and they still can't get the marketing right. There's a handful of guys that get picked as being the golden crop of the sport, but the marketing is not good. And again, people love fight sports. Like, not everyone, but people love to see the adversity. People love to see the champion, hear the stories and all that kind of good stuff. I mean, sports is sports. Sporting is they're keeping score, or, someone has to be the better. But again, you got a golden goose in front of you and you're not taking advantage of it. I mean, I'm a big fan. I know that you don't like I sent you some of the parody stuff because I know it gets you triggered, and I kind of love that for the comments. But I've been watching the Bare Knuckle Fighting League, and I watched them over the 2 years or so evolve into an actual sport. They started out being like a tough man competition. They go from state to state, town to town, kind of just drawing in talent. But now they've actually marketed it into a sport where they have promotions and they have top-notch safety there. They have ambulances on site. So a lot of the other backyard stuff, I rarely see any kind of medical attention ready if a guy gets cleaned up, that they're going to get the medical attention. I went to a fight a couple of years ago where a guy died, not in the ring, but he died of his injuries after. And it made me realize how dangerous this thing is to watch. I watched this guy get beat to death, right? Enjoyed every minute of watching it, sadly to say, but I watched that and I said, wow, that's what I watch. And he passed away. I felt bad. I even put something online about it. And then I went on the next week to watch another fight. Like, it was nothing.
You said something in there that made me realize that this is why boxing is where it is. You said they have a golden goose in front of them and they're not willing to take advantage of it. But yet, on the biggest fight card of the year, the champion who had a chance to unify had the same thing, the same golden goose in front of him, and came out looking like that. So how is the sport in general supposed to market themselves as this big entity when these guys seemingly don't take it serious? And I am not saying that Errol Spence didn't take the fight seriously, but from a casual fan perspective, who we are trying to get to the yard with this show, how are they supposed to market to those guys when you get that look? Every one of those UFC guys goes in there, they are ready to go. And that's a rough sport, and they know what's coming. And even if they lose, all those guys lose graciously, I feel like, too.
I mean, just to give you a feel-good story, and anyone that I'm a casual pedestrian, whatever you want to call it, when it comes to UFC. I was big into it when Rampage and Chuck Liddell and those guys were in it and watching Pride fights. But now I hardly watch the UFC. If I'm like channel surfing, I might catch something on whatever or watch something. But I don't watch the sport technically, and I don't watch the women version of it because I just can't watch women tear each other up like that. But the thing that's kind of crazy to me is that there was a guy that fought a couple weeks ago, and I came across him. I was watching something on TikTok, and The Rock had visited this guy. He was giving like an interview or whatever. Rock comes up, taps him on the shoulder. He sees that it's The Rock, and he has a moment, and he's, but I was like, who is this guy? So then I read the caption, and it talked about that he had $7 in his pocket. The Rock has a similar story about being that broke. And then I had to go look this guy up. And I'm like, wow, like you can't simulate that hunger for a guy who was on top, and then a guy who was literally like, you're my meal ticket. You're my way out of this situation. I'm going to go into a gym floor tonight. If I lose, I'm going to sleep on the gym floor tonight, and I'm going to make enough money. The guy sold his gear from a previous fight for $7,000 just to make ends meet. So when you got those type of storylines and those type of things going, I mean, you want to see a guy win. You want to see a guy prepared. You want to see a guy go out there. And again, I'm not, like you said, I'm not casting aspersions on Errol Spence about not being prepared because I don't know what his camp looked like. I wasn't there. But what I'm saying is that big moment, you got to be ready. You know, Usain Bolt always says, I trained 4 years for 9 seconds. I mean, if you don't understand what kind of preparation that means, I trained 4 years to run 9 seconds. It's crazy.
And think about what goes into those 9 seconds, right? It's not just running. It's everything.
Prep, standing
everything.
there. You know,
yeah, but I'm talking about what he has to do to be good at 9 seconds. Weights, your nutrition, everything. So like a fight camp is what, 3 months?
Yeah, about 3 months, yeah, average.
So for 3 months, you are training to be in the best particular position that you could be, the best shape that you could be, and that's the way that you come out. And it is what it is, man. I mean, we can't make these fighters want it more, but I will say this. I think Bud Crawford wanted it more. I think that he took the narrative about him personally, and he's the wrong guy to be feeding locker room material, whiteboard material to, because I think what did Michael Jordan say? And I took that personally, and Bud strikes me as the same kind of guy.
Yeah, it's something to be said about that. Like I always, I think Kurt Warner said this in a documentary once about him. He's, he great story, by the way, for Kurt Warner, one of my favorite story guys in the NFL. But he said that you can't measure how much a guy wants something. You can measure everything in the NFL or anything in any sport, being the height, the weight, how fast you are, how strong you are. But if you don't have the desire to go out there and do it, it's crazy. You got some guys, I think it was Ali fight when he fought Frazier the second time. And he literally said, if this goes one more round, I'm going to die. Like he put his hands on Angelo Dundee and was like, I am going to die. Like this is just bad. And you can't simulate, you can't teach a guy that. You can't teach someone that. You got to have that innate killer in you to say, okay, I'm going to go out on my shield here. And again, I'm not there to see somebody get hurt. And I think the stoppage was warranted from what I saw. But I think that it could have ended a lot earlier. But I think Crawford wanted to send a message to the division and to Spence personally, like, I got you.
Message sent, message received, and Bud Crawford is the unified champion now. So hopefully you all enjoyed that fight. But Cleve, last time we did a little segment about an obscure boxer, and you want to call it Let's Weigh In. And you know what was great about it? Shout out to Terrible Tim Witherspoon. He found that particular clip, gave us a little bit of a shout out, and that was pretty neat. So, Tim, we hope you're doing well, champ, and we'd love to have you on the show anytime that you'd like. But, Cleve, Let's Weigh In, new segment. I want to hear, and the listeners and viewers want to hear about your obscure fighter of this episode. Take it away, my man.
All right, so my obscure fighter, and again, I'm going back to when I was a little kid. I was about 7 or 8 years old when this fight happened. Alexis Arguello versus Aaron Pryor, who's nicknamed the Hawk. His record is unbelievable for that time frame in the 80s because everyone was a killer in my eyes. But total 40 fights, 39 wins, 35 by knockout, 1 loss. This guy, you got to look him up on YouTube. Amazing fighter. And look up the fight against Alexis Arguello, who was a great fighter in his own right at the time. This is one of the best fights you'll see. It was gritty. It had all the ebbs and flows of someone getting, almost taken out and then ultimately just going, just into chaotic beauty. Or beautiful chaos, what my dad called it back then. This is beautiful chaos. And I'm like, I'm 8 years old. I'm like, what does that mean? Just sounds cool. But it's a beautiful word. Beautiful chaos is what I saw. But that's my obscure guy. Aaron Pryor, great fighter. Even on fight night, I've used him a couple of times and I fought against him and they got it right. This guy was an absolute dog.
So how does a guy like that not become more well-known in boxing history to people other than yourself who's been watching the sport for so long?
I think one of the things is marketing. Because, again, in the 80s, obviously, there was no internet. You've heard me allude to this time and time again. I was one of those kids when people were collecting comics, I was reading Ring Magazine. And I always would open it and look for the rankings. And it was a page, I think it was like page 14 or 15. I mean, it looked like fine print, like it could have been biblical writing, but it was every person in the world at the time ranked. You got your number one contender, champion, and at that time, and I tell this to people all the time, there was one linear champion. There was no, this guy has a WBA, this guy has a WBC. There was, because at some point there was a rubber match or something that unified these titles, and all the alphabet titles were held by one person. When Mike Tyson was the unified champion, that was the time that you saw a guy walking in, 3 straps on, and 4 walking in behind him. And you're like, wait a minute, like how many belts? Everyone that had a belt, he had your belt. He had your belt. And sadly enough, after Holyfield and Riddick and Lennox Lewis, there was a time when there was 6 or 7 heavyweight champions, and none of them were American. That I was like, wow, we have 7 world champion heavyweight fighters, and none of them are American at that moment, because the Klitschko's had between the two of them, they had 3 of the belts, and because they're brothers, they said they would never fight each other, so those belts were never going to be unified by them, which I understand. That's your brother.
Yeah, but talk about a great marketing opportunity.
Oh my God, Super Six.
There's many opportunities there that are being missed, but go ahead and look up that fighter, because Cleve does have a lot of this knowledge, and it's always worth my time whenever you tell me to go look up a fight or a fighter or whatever. Is this the guy, the Hawk? Is he the guy with that video when he knocked the guy out and he puts his arms out?
I'm glad you said that. So the original Hawk was Aaron Pryor, but Julian Jackson, he was the Mike Tyson of the smaller weights. He had a hammer. The guy was amazing. The guy was strong in both hands, and he's one of those guys that he had a big ego, and that was it. Before we go, I want to talk about something that you and I talked about offline, and it's about the judging. The judging is always coming out to be so stupid. So there was a fight a week ago with Kambosos. Did you see that fight?
I haven't seen that fight. No.
Okay, so I'm gonna kind of just give my take, and then we'll talk about it offline. About it, but basically, you're watching someone get beaten up, punished, and they're holding their own, but they're literally losing rounds in front of you. And then when it goes to the cards, one of these judges has this fight so different. I'm like, wait a minute, he's sitting there with 2 other judges. How do you get this number? What rounds did you give this other fighter? And the guy literally was one of those things where when they announced it, Kambosos didn't look like, I thought I won. He took the victory because they called his name. But the other guy literally, like, you could see the dejection in his face. Even when they interviewed him, he was like, wow. I'm glad he didn't leave the ring. That was the classiest thing. He went to go walk out, and on his own, with no one tapping him, he turned around, walked back in, walked up to Cam and hugged him and says, hey, man, great fight. And I said, wow, he's better than me, because I would have had sour grapes for breakfast, lunch, and dinner for the rest of the month. Shakur Stevenson got into the apron and then confronted Kambosos and said, hey, I want to fight you. And they kept deflecting it to him fighting Haney. He said, I'm not taking 25% to fight Haney. I want to fight one of you guys because, again, I'm hunting down guys. And it was a very interesting exchange. It's online. It's actually pretty funny. But Shakur is one of those guys that he's doing what he's supposed to do. People are kind of bagging on him that he's too arrogant and too brash. He's in the business to be that. He wants to be a recognized world champion. And this, I got to go through to get it. But they got to do something about this judging. Timothy Bradley, of all people, mentioned, and Tim is a great guy. I met Tim at the National Harbor out here, and he said something about it where I was like, well, you were handed a victory that I thought was questionable at the time, but again, that's me. But they got to do something about this judging. But as you saw last night, no judges could tell you that fight was going to go in one fighter's way or not. It was clearly a dog walking, and it was a beatdown.
Without getting too much into this, because I think we should save it for the next time when we have Supreme on here. We did talk about it last time, but boxing judging to me is akin to what people say about baseball umpires and how they want robot umpires in there to do balls and strikes and so forth. And the subjective nature of the judging and of being an umpire, there's something that lends itself to the sport that we all like. If we made it automated, people wouldn't like that. However, the lack of accountability, I think, is what really bothers people when it comes to these types of things. So if you're a boxing judge, you can essentially judge the fight however you would like. And the only accountability that you have is to the court of public opinion. And who cares about that? Because it doesn't have anything to do with your paycheck, has nothing to do with your job. And until they kind of fix that, and the way that I propose that they fixed it, which got a lot of play on YouTube last week, was that we have a mid-fight interview with some of these judges.
I think that's great.
Just a minute to hear about what they're seeing in this fight, especially a fight that to that point seems it's going to go the distance. You get a knockout, you get a stoppage. Who cares what the judges think? We have a definitive decision. But when it goes to the cards, we need to see that. The other thing that I would like to see is we always shove a mic in the athlete's face after a tough game or after even a win. We never, ever shove the microphones in front of the refs, in front of the judges, what have you. And I think that accountability or lack thereof is what makes people hesitant about the judging and get out with these conspiracy theories about what happens and how the sport is rigged. And you hear this in a lot of sports. You hear it about the NFL, you hear it about the NBA. It's not just boxing. And so I think that is a good teaser for next week. But listen, how did you think the fight went? Were you a Crawford guy or you a Spence guy? Don't forget, call or text the show. Area code 703-718-6314 is the number to do that. We are part of I&C Sports. You can find us on YouTube. Make sure to like and subscribe. It's not mandatory. It is very, very helpful, though. If you want to find us on TikTok, at I&C Sports is the handle to do that. We get a lot of play on there. We have a little bit of fun. I like to post some clips there so you can find us there. We're part of the Matty Ice Media Network. Right now, the website is under construction, but MattyIceMedia.com is the place that you can find this entity of I&C Sports. You can find this guy on the manual and political football. Cleve, any parting thoughts before we get out of here?
Yeah, I know we talked about the landscape of boxing, and there was another fight that happened on Tuesday morning to be exact, where everyone's at work or everyone's sleeping. It happened in Japan with Inoki, who is a beast. Absolute monster. I think his nickname is Monster. But the guy that fought him had to travel to Japan to fight him. And he questioned about the hand wraps over there and the regulation of that. They had their hands wrapped in front of him, which made him, more easy to go in. But there's no regulation of even steroid use or anything like that. This guy started out at a very small weight, I think 108 or 109, and now he's moving up, and he wants to fight Tank at some point, which would be great. But how the little guys carried his power up. So boxing is doing everything it can to be relevant and stay relevant. But again, only hardcore people that like the sport are checking in, and only on these mega fights you get a casual fan for a couple of weeks, and then they go off and never think about the sport again until the next big fight.
Yep, and hopefully that is not the case with this podcast. I want to thank everybody for tuning in this week and supporting this show, supporting I&C, supporting the network. Hope this finds you well. Hope this finds you safe from me and from Cleve. This is the Cornermen. The opinions and viewpoints expressed on I&C Sports are those of Matt Frates, Brad Powell, and their guests, and not necessarily those of the Matty Ice Media Network. I&C Sports is exclusively owned by Matt Frates and Brad Powell and is brought to you by the Matty Ice Media Network.